I've got two questions. Number one, and you should hand the paper in, even if all that winds up written on it is your name. You can still give it to me, because part of what I am doing is taking attendance, but I am also assessing how well folks are focused on the readings. Question number one. According to Chief Justice Earl Warren, what was the most important decision issued during his tenure leading the Supreme Court? Ideally, you're going to give me the name of a Supreme Court case here, but if you don't remember the name of it but can describe it in a sentence, that's not as good, but that's also good. If you just came in, put your name on a sheet of paper. Question number one. According to Chief Justice Earl Warren, what was the most important Supreme Court decision issued during his tenure as Chief Justice? Question number two. Answer this one in a sentence. If you don't know the answer to the first one, then this one's going to be hard to answer. But I'm talking about the same case now. Question number two. Why did some of the justices of the Supreme Court argue that the court should not issue that decision that Chief Justice Warren was referring to? One sentence or so. Just why were some justices opposed to this decision? Obviously, you could write a whole paper about that, but I just need a sentence. You're done, you can pass those pages forward. Yeah. Yeah. Just pass those forward when you're done. Make sure to turn in your paper, even if it just has your name on it, because I'm taking attendance. Anybody else? All right, raise your hand if you listened to the podcast that was assigned for reading, right? So part of the point of this exercise is to take attendance. Part of the point of this exercise is to encourage everyone to do the reading. And part of the point of doing it today is that the readings for today included some conventional pages in your textbook, and they also included a 40-minute podcast, which clearly provided the answers to both of those questions. And there are several additional such podcasts located on the syllabus as for the remainder of the semester. And the podcasts are just as important as the readings. I'm not going to say they're more important. The readings are very important. Everything's important, right? So if it's listed with a bullet on the syllabus as an assigned reading, then you got to try to do it in advance of class. And I will do something like this on occasion. We're just going to grade these as either, the way I usually do it is check plus, like if your answers to both questions are really good. Check if you've got some indication that you did some of the reading and you've got some content in your answers. Present if you were here but have no content in your answers, and absent if you were not here. and however many times they do this during the course of the semester, those check plus grades, present grades, just get folded into your attendance and participation grade. Okay. I'll tell you the answers to the 2 questions in a minute. The other paper number 1, of course, is due tomorrow. Thanks to an email from Colin this morning. I just actually created the thing on Blackboard where you can upload it because I had forgotten to do that. So if you go to Blackboard now, there is an assignment that says paper assignment number 1, and you should be able to upload it there. And so again, it's due tomorrow by the end of the day. It's due tomorrow by like 4:30 p.m. because that's roughly when the political science department closes. But as I said earlier, if you're not able to, don't come to campus just to turn in the hard copy. If you're not already on campus, just make sure you upload it to Blackboard by then. That'll get time stamped. I'll know it's on time, and then you can just bring in the hard copy on Monday or Tuesday. But don't forget, because the stack of hard copies is the thing that we actually grade, right? And so if you don't give us a hard copy, then when I'm handing papers back, you're going to say, where's my paper? And I'm going to say, I don't have one from you. Did you give us a hard copy? Right? So you got to give us both. Make sure you give us both, but just make sure at least one of them is on time by 4:30 tomorrow. Question?
So where are we turning the physical copy?
Political Science Department. Eggers 100.
To the department office?
Yeah, when you walk into the political science department, there's a counter there with a box that has folders for several classes, and there's one for our class in there. If you can't find it, just ask one of the staff. Question?
I was going to ask
Same thing. Okay.
Eggers.
Yeah. Eggers 100, first floor of Eggers, political science department. Okay. Other questions about that paper? Yeah.
So, just because it's a case memo, is it acceptable to use first and second person, or do you want us to avoid doing that?
Yes, that's fine. Your address, it's a memo addressed to a justice from you. I actually don't mind using first person in a regular paper, too, as long as you're not overdoing it. It's not a paper about your thoughts and feelings, right? But it's a paper about your own argument about the Constitution. I don't mind the use of first person. Okay, so our focus today is basically voting rights in the 1960s. Chief Justice Earl Warren said in an interview, like an oral history interview after he retired, he said the most important decision issued during his tenure was Baker versus Carr, which was a case about the drawing of legislative districts, which was a surprising answer to the interviewer, because Earl Warren was Chief Justice for Brown versus Board of Education and Miranda versus Arizona and lots of other cases that are more famous than Baker versus Carr. But Warren said the most important, in his view, was Baker versus Carr. So that's one of the cases we'll talk about today. This question of the role of the Supreme Court in terms of like policing the operation of our electoral process is of course still very much a significant question today. If you'll remember our first day of class, right, I showed you a map of North Carolina's congressional districts because just that previous week, shortly before our first day of class, a federal district court had ruled that North Carolina's congressional districts were unconstitutional. Just last week, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that Pennsylvania's congressional districts were unconstitutional. And just yesterday, the leader of the Pennsylvania State Senate issued a public statement that he was planning to ignore the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision because he disagreed with it so strongly. He may well get held in contempt of court and jailed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. We will keep an eye on that one and see how it plays out. So it's a major issue still today, right? Who's allowed to vote? How are votes conducted? How are they counted? How are they tabulated? How are they aggregated to produce a winner? From what districts are people's votes collected? Right? How are these district lines drawn? These are major questions that have huge impacts on the operation of our democracy, and they are questions into which the Supreme Court frequently gets drawn. Prior to the 1960s, they were not they were still important questions, but they were not questions into which the Supreme Court frequently got drawn. Right? That basically started in the 1960s. In addition to the Supreme Court, the rest of the country was paying lots of attention to voting rights during this period too. I'll give you an example. So from 1961 to 1971, the Constitution was amended 4 times. Right? Since 1971, the Constitution has been amended once. Right? From 1961 to 1971, the Constitution was amended 4 times. That's an unusually large number of constitutional amendments in a decade. And 3 of the 4 were efforts to expand voting rights. The 23rd Amendment, which was ratified in 1961, gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president. Right? In the Electoral College, Washington, D.C. will have the same number of representatives as the smallest states. Right? So just like Delaware has 3 representatives and 3 electors in the Electoral College, Washington, D.C. will also have 3. Prior to that, residents of Washington, D.C. were not allowed to vote for president. Residents of Washington, D.C. are still not allowed to vote for Congress. They vote to elect a non-voting member of the House of Representatives, but that doesn't really count that much because she doesn't get to vote. Residents of Washington, D.C. are still unrepresented in Congress, but since the 23rd Amendment, they are allowed to vote for president. The 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 1964, made poll taxes unconstitutional for federal elections. Right? For federal elections, you cannot be charged to cast a vote. That is what a poll tax is, a fee that you have to pay in order to vote. Unconstitutional for federal elections. The 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, had to do with succession to office if the president dies or resigns or otherwise becomes incapacitated. This was prompted by the Kennedy assassination, where in the immediate aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination, there was some fear that he was basically completely incapacitated, right? No longer brain functioning, but not actually deceased yet, right? Heart still beating or whatever the medical details are, right? So is he still president, right? The Constitution said previously that if the presidency becomes vacant, it has come up several times in the past year. And then the 26th Amendment, which was ratified in 1971, granted voting rights to 18-year-olds. Right? And the history of this one is pretty fascinating, right? So before the 26th Amendment was proposed, 46 states had minimum voting ages of 21. Right? Under the Constitution, it's mostly up to states to set the requirements for who's allowed to vote, even in federal elections. Right? 46 states had minimum voting ages of 21. In 1970, Congress enacted a law. It was an amendment to the Federal Voting Rights Act that required states to lower their voting ages to 18. And the Supreme Court struck that law down. Congress can't force the states to lower their voting ages. Under the Constitution, it's mostly up to states to set the rules for who's allowed to vote. Congress can't do that. But meanwhile, even though the law was challenged and the Supreme Court was in the process of striking it down, 6 states went ahead on their own and lowered their voting ages to 18. They weren't required to do so because the court struck the law down, but they did it anyway in 1970. And in 1971, Congress proposed the 26th Amendment, which would amend the Constitution to lower it to 18 in every state. And that amendment was ratified by 3/4 of the states in about 3 months, which is insanely fast. Right? Constitution is really difficult to amend because you need 2/3 of each House of Congress, and then you need ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. 3/4 of the states ratified it in 3 months. The major explanation for all of that is that we are in the midst of the Vietnam War, where hundreds of thousands of 18-year-old men are being drafted and sent off to fight. And how in the heck are you going to say you're old enough to go fight to defend your country, but you are not old enough to vote? This is not the first time in American history something like that has happened. You may recall from Con Law 1 that during the Civil War, when hundreds of thousands of African American men joined the Union Army, right? They then argued after the war that they should be entitled to vote, and Abraham Lincoln endorsed that argument, said that they fought for to defend the country, they should be allowed to vote, shortly before he was assassinated, and then that eventually led to the 15th Amendment. Okay. So the Constitution's amended 4 times in this decade, 3 of which are direct efforts to expand voting rights. That seems pretty notable. During this same decade, we've talked a little bit about this previously, Congress passes the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is a major federal statutory expansion of voting rights. Supreme Court got drawn into the conflicts about the Voting Rights Act, too. That was mostly a fight in Congress, right? But then the law was challenged as unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court upheld it. There's a couple cases in which the Supreme Court dealt with challenges to the Voting Rights Act. The one I mentioned on the handout is South Carolina versus Katzenbach. The one that's actually in your reading is a different one from around the same time called Katzenbach versus Morgan. Both of them held that yes, the federal government has the authority, at least in some instances, to compel states to do a better job of protecting voting rights. Right? The biggest issue in these cases was what's called the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, which says that if your state or local jurisdiction has a documented history of racial discrimination in voting rights, then you cannot change anything about your election laws without getting the federal government's approval. Even if you're changing something that doesn't have anything to do with race, you got to get the federal government's approval, because in our experience, sometimes things that look on the surface to not be about race, in fact, have an underlying racial motivation, and so we want to look and make sure. If you just say you're closing some polling places to save money, you're not discriminating against anybody, but then we look, and all the polling places you are closing are in African-American neighborhoods, then we are going to say, no, you are not allowed to do that. Right? Supreme Court upholds that provision in those 2 cases. Yeah.
What was the name of that provision again?
It's called the preclearance. The preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's called that because the states or local jurisdictions have to get clearance in advance before they change their voting laws. And it did not. One of the controversial things about this provision is it did not apply nationwide. If you lived in a jurisdiction that had no documented history of racial discrimination in voting rights, then you could change your voting laws, right? So Massachusetts could change its voting laws without the federal government's approval, but Mississippi couldn't, right? The Supreme Court said that was okay.
I think earlier you said this is like all but wiped out, or is it still in right?
In 2013, Supreme Court struck this provision down in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, and immediately after Shelby County versus Holder, which was June 2013, I believe, immediately after that, a whole bunch of states, mostly in the South, right, that had previously been subject to this preclearance requirement, started making all kinds of changes to their election laws, adopting voter ID requirements, redrawing districts, closing polling places. Those are the big ones. Making changes that they previously would have had to seek the Federal Justice Department's approval for and would not have gotten. And now the court just struck that provision down, so they pushed through a whole bunch of changes really rapidly. In 2014, there was a ton of state legislative changes on voting rights. So that's a decision that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But in the 1960s, the Supreme Court was okay with it. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court was saying, look, 15th Amendment has been in here for a century. 15th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote to anybody on account of race. And we have clearly been not living up to that amendment because there is a well-documented, systematic effort across the South to prevent African Americans from registering to vote, sometimes using actual violent terror to prevent people from registering to vote, and sometimes using subtle legal means, right, like literacy tests that it turns out somehow all the poorly educated white people in the South manage to pass the literacy test, and all the poorly educated black people in the South manage to fail it, because there's just some local voting registrar who gets to decide whether you passed or failed it. Like, it's like an oral test, like a verbal test. They'll like hand you a constitution and start asking you questions about it, and then they say whether you passed or not. So the history of racial discrimination in voting is severe enough, the Supreme Court says, as to justify the federal government's significant intervention in the Voting Rights Act. One of the interesting things about these Voting Rights Act cases, remember the cases about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States. In those cases, Congress had said it was passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act under its authority to regulate interstate commerce, right? Which was maybe strategically the right thing to do, because the court had been interpreting Congress's commerce powers very broadly, and we are regulating for-profit businesses that are engaged in commerce, so it does make some sense. And it worked. They won the case, and the law was upheld, but they avoided relying on the constitutional authorization of congressional power that seemed more directly relevant, which was Congress's power to enforce the 14th Amendment. In these cases, in South Carolina versus Katzenbach and Katzenbach versus Morgan, Congress relied directly on enforcement provisions of the 15th Amendment, right? The 14th Amendment ends with a line that says Congress has the power by appropriate legislation to enforce the provisions of this article. The 15th Amendment ends with like an identical line. 15th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote. No state shall deny the right to vote on account of race. And then it says Congress has the power by appropriate legislation to enforce the provisions of this article. So Congress relied directly on that successfully in the Supreme Court. So it's a pretty clear indication from the Supreme Court that Congress has expansive powers to promote racial equality in voting. Right? States are not allowed to deny the right to vote on the basis of race, and the Congress has the power to enforce that provision. And that's what Congress says it's doing in the Voting Rights Act. And the Supreme Court upholds it. Right? Meanwhile, however, there are lots of other voting rights issues that are not being directly addressed in Congress for a variety of reasons. And these ones start to come to the Supreme Court, too. This is a state. It has 4 congressional districts. Sometime back in the beginning of the 20th century, we drew them like that. Right? Most of the state is rural. Back in the beginning of the 20th century, each of those districts was roughly equal in size. There was no explicit rule back then that the districts had to be equal in size, but that's how we drew them back then, and they were roughly equal in size. Roughly the same number of people lived in each district. But we have not redrawn the districts in a long time. We conduct the census every 10 years, but our state always winds up with the same number of seats, 4 seats, so we got no reason to redraw the districts, so we've never gotten around to it. So our congressional map still looks like this, except there is one city, major city in the state, that's here, and over the past 50 years, lots of people have moved from the farms to the city, right? So that at time A, we had districts with roughly the same number of people in them, right? And each district gets 1 representative, right? And so if each district's got 10,000 people, roughly, and 1 representative, that seems roughly fair. Now, we have districts over here with 2,000 residents, and this one has 100,000 residents. And they each have 1 representative. That's not a real map. That's not what an actual state looks like. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it is basically an accurate description of what was going on in multiple states. In the 1960s, Tennessee had not redrawn its state legislative districts since 1901. There was one district that had about 2,000 residents and another district that had about 50,000 residents. Alabama had not redrawn its districts since 1900. There was one district in the State House that had 6,700 residents and another district that had 104,000 residents. In the State Senate, there was one that had 15,000 and there was one that had 634,000, each with one representative. And voting rights advocates had repeatedly challenged these failures of state legislatures to redraw their districts. That does not seem fair. 600,000 people with one representative, and then you drive out to the country and 15,000 people out there also have one representative? Doesn't seem fair. And there have been repeated efforts to challenge it. And one of these efforts back in the 1940s had made its way to the Supreme Court and had failed. Right? In a case called Colgrove versus Green in 1946. Supreme Court said, I don't know, maybe seems unfair, nothing we can do about it. Courts should stay out of legislative districting decisions altogether. These decisions are inherently political. They always have been so. You cannot come up with any process about how to draw the districts from which partisan representatives are going to be elected. You cannot make that into a non-political process. It's an inherently political decision that has severe political implications, right? Really significant political implications. There's no provision of the Constitution which clearly and explicitly says, when drawing legislative districts, you got to follow these certain rules and requirements. There's nothing clear and explicit in there. And if the courts did get involved, we're not really sure what we should even say. There's no... What would the rule be? There's no... we don't have a clear rule in mind. Even if we were to get involved and say, this seems unfair, what would the fair rule be? We don't have any clear, judicially manageable standard that we have come up with to impose. As a result, if we did get involved, we might make things worse, just as likely as we might make them better. These are all not actual quotations, but more or less paraphrasing Justice Frankfurter's opinion in Colgrove versus Green. And then the most famous line from this opinion, Justice Frankfurter wrote, "Courts ought not to enter this political thicket." I have a little trouble pronouncing that word. But the idea is a dense, thorn bush, right? That you should not try to, crawl through, right? Because you are going to get stuck. Courts ought not to enter this political thicket. We should just stay out of it. That was Frankfurter's argument for the court in 1946.
In 1956, was this a partisan issue? Was it Dems versus Republicans, or was it just rural versus city? Rural folks, which is
so that early decision is 1946, and the later decisions are in the 1960s. In both periods, this is true, but I think it's more true by the 1960s, right? At one level, what we are talking about here is an urban versus rural divide, right? If what population shifts in general throughout the country over the course of the 20th century have involved people moving away from rural areas and into urban areas. And that's true in most regions of the country. And so you wind up with things like this, right? So it's an urban-rural disparity where rural voters are overrepresented in state legislatures and in Congress. In most parts of the country, or at least in many parts of the country, that also correlates with a racial divide, right? Where African Americans are disproportionately living in the cities, right? And so if urban voters are underrepresented in many parts of the country. That means African American voters are underrepresented too. So we don't have here an example of it's not an example of explicit racial discrimination. It's not as directly racialized as like the application of literacy tests across the South, where there was clear evidence that Southern voter registration officials were just blatantly using literacy tests as a way to disenfranchise black voters. It's not as directly racialized as that, but in many parts of the country it seems pretty racialized. Right? In Tennessee and Alabama, the reason I emphasize those two states is those are two of the states where cases came from to the Supreme Court. In Tennessee and Alabama, African Americans, for sure, were disproportionately living in the cities. And so that's already underway by the 40s, but that's even more true by 1961, right? So Frankfurter's argument, nothing clear in the constitutional text that explicitly forbids this. State legislatures have always been in charge of this process. We don't have any judicially manageable standard that we can think of to impose. We're worried that we might make things worse rather than making them better. So courts are going to stay out of this political thicket altogether. Some of you will recall from Conlaw 1 that this is a sort of argument that Justice Frankfurter and some other justices often made. It's an argument for judicial restraint, right? That the court should exercise its own powers cautiously. What's wrong with that argument in this context? Yeah.
The African American voters have no avenue for recourse because it's about voting. So it's not like they can pass laws in order to help themselves in this case. The only option is the courts.
Seems pretty good, right? Colin?
It just seems like Congress is obviously ineffective at enforcing or drafting legislation that protects African American voters, because the court would be the people that would support that, but since there's not enough legislation that divvies up the turf effectively, then they're ineffective too.
It's certainly true that when you're talking about legislatures that have not redrawn their districts since 1901, it does not seem like either the state legislatures or Congress are effectively addressing the issue, right? And even logically, it doesn't even seem to make sense to tell voters that the proper solution lies with their elected legislatures, right? The logic of this argument sometimes makes sense, right? And the logic of this argument is that, look, the Constitution is supposed to put some basic limits on government, right? Some fundamental important things. Supreme Court's here to make sure the government doesn't do something blatantly, obviously unconstitutional. That's what we're here for. But most of the time, in a democracy, most of our important policy questions should be decided by the people's elected representatives. So, if the abortion laws in our state are not what you think they should be, you think they should be more strict or less strict, right? You might make a judicial restraint argument to say, look, that's not clearly specified in the Constitution. Why don't you go to your legislature and urge them to make a more strict or less strict abortion law? Maybe that argument makes sense. On voting rights cases, it does not even really logically make sense, right? This legislature has 4 people in it, right? Because that's the kind of state I can draw with chalk, right? This legislature of this state has 4 people in it, 3 of whom represent these districts. How in the heck are those 3 people going to vote to redraw a fair set of districts? None of them will have jobs anymore, right? If you are going to draw a fair set of districts in this state, they're going to have to look something like that. This is all one district. There's 3 districts representing the city, because that's where all the people are. These 3 guys, or 2 of them at least, just lost their jobs. How are they ever going to support them? There's no plausible scenario in which our elected representatives, who were elected via an undemocratic system that does not allow everyone a fair chance to participate, to say they are the guys who are going to fix it, is to say they are going to get rid of the system under which they have repeatedly been elected. It does not seem likely that that's going to happen. Right? And so it does not seem likely that anybody is going to fix the problem if the courts don't fix it. If you will recall from Common Law 1, Justice Stone's footnote number 4 in U.S. versus Caroline Products, a 1938 decision about filled milk products, right, where he inserted this weird footnote that seemed like it had nothing to do with the case, that suggested that what Justice Stone said, yeah, most of the time judicial restraint is a good idea. In this particular case, I don't think we should second-guess Congress's judgment about this milk regulation, right? However, footnote, there are certain kinds of cases where I'm not sure judicial restraint is the right approach. And one of the paragraphs in that footnote said, cases that involve the fair and democratic operation of the political process itself. Right? If the elected legislature has made the democratic process undemocratic, it does not seem very reasonable to urge the voters to appeal to that legislature to try to fix the problem. And that is what Frankfurter was telling them to do. And by 1961, Supreme Court changes its mind. Right? Voting rights advocates kept bringing these cases back. Oh, I know we lost in 1946, but we still think our arguments are better. We got some new justices up in here. We're going to try again. We got more evidence about the disproportionate impacts of these failures to redraw the districts. They come back to the court in 1962 in a case called Baker versus Carr. That's the one that Earl Warren says is the most important case while he was up there. Justice Frankfurter wrote a dissenting opinion in Baker versus Carr, a 55-page dissenting opinion, and immediately after the court's decision was released, Frankfurter had a massive stroke and never returned to the court. And I don't know whether this makes any sense at all, but people always said that this case caused his stroke. I'm not a doctor. I don't even know if that's possible, right? But he, like Frankfurter's whole career, was dedicated to this principle. And he sometimes won, and he sometimes lost. But this was an issue on which he had explicitly argued that the court should not get involved because it's inconsistent with the principle of judicial restraint. And he lost badly in Baker versus Carr. And then he had a stroke. Justice Clark wrote an opinion that is in your book. It's in Baker versus Carr in the textbook as a concurring opinion. Justice Clark started that one off as a dissent. When the court first heard deliberations in the case and they voted privately, they're like, how are we going to come out? Justice Clark voted with Frankfurter. And then when he sat down to write the opinion, he changed his mind. And this happens sometimes, right? Think about when you're writing a paper and you think you have a pretty good argument, and then you go to try to defend that argument persuasively, and you can't actually find the right evidence that you're looking for, and you're like, well, maybe my argument was not quite right. Maybe I got to reconsider it. That happens to the justices too, right? The process of writing the opinion sometimes leads them to reconsider. And if you read the very beginning of Justice Clark's concurring opinion, it says, I would not support our unprecedented judicial intervention into this process of legislative districting were it not for the fact that I am now convinced that there is no other institution in our government that could plausibly address this. There's significant constitutional principles involved, severe potential violations of those constitutional principles, and there's no other institution that can plausibly address it. So I am persuaded that we have to do so. Justice Clark said. in Baker versus Carr, the court overturned Colgrove. They said these cases are, in fact, justiciable after all. Which is the fancy lawyer and judge word for an issue that is fit to be decided by courts. Right? Some issues are non-justiciable. They just cannot be decided by courts at all. We had previously held that how legislatures draw their electoral districts was non-justiciable. That's what we said in Colgrove. We changed our mind. This issue is justiciable after all. We're still not quite sure what to do about it. Right? Remember how the court likes to move one case at a time, a little cautiously. Brown versus Board of Education, they had a couple different arguments in the same case. Right? This one in Baker, they just say the issue is justiciable. We send it back to the lower court for further proceedings. We will address what the constitutional requirement actually is at some future date. And then a series of additional cases come back to the Supreme Court. These cases are all listed on the handout. In Gray versus Sanders in 1963, and Reynolds versus Sims, 1964, the court says the principle required by, as we said in Baker versus Carr, this issue is justiciable, so now we're going to go ahead and decide it. And the principle required by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is the principle of one person, one vote. Right? This is not allowed. Right? Every electoral district has to be approximately equal in population. One person, one vote. You will sometimes see scholars or journalists say one man, one vote, which even would maybe not be that surprising in the early 1960s, but that is not what the Supreme Court said. From the very beginning, in every single one of these Supreme Court opinions, the Supreme Court said one person, one vote. I don't know why some people tried to switch that to one man, one vote. So one person, one vote. And that's the requirement. So what this means is, immediately, right now, in 1963, 1964, every state legislature in the country has to redraw its electoral districts. Right? They were not all as bad as Tennessee and Alabama, where they hadn't redrawn them in 60 years. But every state in the country, all 50, had electoral districts that were not approximately equal in size. Right? That is just not a principle that the state legislatures had adhered to until the court told them they had to adhere to it. Every state legislature in the country has to redraw its districts. And then moving forward, every 10 years, whenever there's a census, whether or not the number of districts in your state is changing, you're going to have to redraw your districts. Because even if you have the same number of districts, I'm pretty sure somebody has moved from one part of the state to another over the past 10 years, right? You got to look at the current population numbers. And maybe if you've got a small state with not very many people, maybe people haven't moved that much. You don't got to move the lines that much. But you got to look at the map, you got to look at the numbers, and you got to redraw the districts to make sure that they are approximately equal in size. Because that principle is mandated by the Equal Protection Clause. Questions? Yeah.
So if all that was decided, then why is it even a constitutional question now?
So the thing that was it's basically like one thing that was decided, or maybe it's two things. The first thing that's decided, which is huge, is that courts can weigh in on electoral districting decisions, right? In the 40s, they were saying we don't even get involved in this, right? So the first thing is the courts can get involved. And then the second thing they decide is one of the principles that the Constitution requires is one person, one vote. So every legislative district has to be approximately equal in size. And so that has an enormous impact, right? Every state has to redraw their maps, and now they're going to have to keep redrawing them every 10 years to keep them approximately equal in size. But it does not say there are other questions that come up that are not yet answered, right? Subsequently, the court is forced to answer questions about, can state legislatures intentionally consider voters' race when drawing legislative districts? And first glance, maybe the obvious answer is no, right? If we're trying to like draw the district lines in some ways to suppress the African American vote, that seems unconstitutional. But in the 70s, and then especially in the 1980s, many state legislatures said, under the 15th Amendment and under the Voting Rights Act, we are trying to do everything we can to enhance the representation of African American voters. And so states were sometimes considering as one factor among many, well, where do the black voters live? And can we try to draw some of the districts to help them elect a black representative? Like, we have not had a black member of Congress since the 1870s. Like, what the heck is that? Like, we got a sizable black minority population, but the districts have always been drawn in such a way as to disperse that minority across all the districts. So there's no district, even though this city is majority black, there's no congressional district that's majority black. Like, let's instead make sure we draw 1 or 2 congressional districts that are majority black, and we'll wind up with some black members of Congress. And the effort was successful. In the 1980s, there was a significant increase in the number of black members of Congress, partly because of those kinds of districting decisions. But then the court had to decide whether you were allowed to do that or not. And that's not answered by these cases. Now, the issue that is front page news now, and before both our state and federal courts in multiple cases, is whether the legislatures can explicitly consider partisan advantage. Right? The Republican leaders of the North Carolina legislature openly acknowledge that they drew the map the way they drew it in order to enhance the election of as many Republicans as possible. That was their principal goal. They have testified under oath that that was the principal goal that they were trying to accomplish. And the courts have, that is not answered in these cases. These cases just say the districts have to be approximately equal size. North Carolina's districts are all approximately the same size. And they drew them in such a way as to make sure the state could elect 10 Republicans and only 3 Democrats. Right? Is that unconstitutional? That question is not... The decisions from the 1960s allow the federal courts, enable the federal courts to weigh in on these new questions, because we said, oh no, it's not just a political thicket, we're not going to stay out of it altogether, we can weigh in on these questions, and we're going to answer one of them. One of our answers is they got to be approximately equal in size. But then over time, and Frankfurter, by the way, might have said, I told you this was going to happen, like we thought we were going to, decide this question, but there's new ones that are going to keep coming up, we're going to be stuck in this political thicket permanently, and he was not wrong about that. But I'm not sure that Frankfurter's alternative is better. Just let partisan elected legislators draw districts however they want, even if it's blatantly undemocratic and unfair. Does not sound like the right answer to me. And so the courts are stuck trying to answer these new questions year after year. And the big one that the court has never yet given a clear answer to is whether intentional efforts to promote partisan advantage are impermissible. That's the question that's before the Supreme Court this year. Other questions? Anybody write in about one of the districting cases for tomorrow? Yeah. So one question that's worth thinking about is, what are the key constitutional principles in these cases from the 1960s, right? What are the key sort of driving constitutional principles that lead the court to these decisions in Baker and Reynolds and these other cases? And are those principles persuasive to you, right? Do they make sense to you? Do you agree with them? And how do those principles apply to the questions that the courts are facing today, right? Because it's a new question. It's a question that the court didn't decide in the 1960s, but it's a related question. And so here are the principles that the court was trying to act on in the 1960s, and if the court sticks to those precedents and it continues to adhere to those principles, then what would that mean for the questions that are before the court today?
I feel in, I guess, like a post-Brown versus Board of Education world, judicial restraint just as a whole is like totally transformed, because in like the Brown case, they were basically saying with deliberate speed, like they were telling people they had to do stuff. Like that's not restraining at all. That's giving them demand. So like once that precedent is set and you have the ability to start telling people to do stuff, you like can't renege on that. Like now you gotta start telling people to do stuff if you see it unconstitutional.
Brown versus Board of Education is a clear example of a court that is not engaged in judicial restraint, right? The usual opposite term that is used is judicial activism, which is a little bit of a tricky term because people often use it pejoratively, as judicial activism is something the court is not supposed to do. But we don't really have another good label for... Some justices argue that the court should exercise its own powers really cautiously and reluctantly, and some justices are willing for the court to exercise its powers more actively, more aggressively, robustly, whatever adverb you want there. I think judicial activism is the best available label. Just bear in mind that you can use the label pejoratively if you want, but you can also use it kind of analytically just to sort of describe two different approaches that the justices might take, whether or not you agree with them. We're trying to just understand what they're doing, right? And so Brown is clearly an example of judicial activism, right? It is an order from the Supreme Court to local school districts across a substantial portion of the country to change the way that they have been assigning students to schools from forever, right? It's a significant judicial intervention. Brown, we know, was quite controversial. Baker and Reynolds were not as controversial as Brown. They were politically controversial, they didn't produce the kind of violent resistance that Brown did, but they were politically controversial. And the court, for whatever reason, the court was more successful in forcing compliance with Baker and Reynolds than it was with Brown. Remember, Brown, for like a whole decade, like in the Deep South, there's no compliance at all. And Baker and Reynolds, every single state legislature in the country, some of them grumbled, but every single one of them redrew the districts. I don't know for sure how to explain that difference in the patterns of compliance. I do have some partial explanations, at least. One explanation is that, remember, with Brown, compliance got much better once Congress and the President were helping the court, starting in the mid-1960s. In Baker and Reynolds, it's kind of all three institutions acting at the same time, right? Baker's a little earlier than the 65 Voting Rights Act, but in the mid-60s, right, all of these institutions are pushing states to better protect voting rights. All working at the same time. The court wasn't way out in front of Congress and the President. And then the other thing that I think played part of this, a role in the story is that following Brown versus Board of Education, the court really backed down. Right? The court said Southern school districts got to change these policies, and then it just backed off. Right? And it mostly avoided hearing any further cases for several years, just left it to the lower courts to try to figure out on their own. In a couple instances of different kinds of racial discrimination, like interracial marriage laws that came to the court just refused to hear the cases. The court seemed like it was reluctant to keep pushing. And many folks in the South, many white folks in the South, took that as a signal that they could get away with noncompliance. In Baker and Gray and Reynolds, the court was hearing like one of these cases every year and like reiterating the principles and really insistent on them and showed no inclination to be tolerant of states avoiding their constitutional mandate, right? So maybe that stronger signal helped play a role. But for whatever reason, all 50 states complied relatively quickly. One thing that scholars who write about these cases often try to reflect on, this is also a really hard question to answer because it's complicated. But so if part of the purpose of Baker and Reynolds was to address the problem of significant underrepresentation of urban and disproportionately African American voters, right? Or forcing districts that are going to look more like that. If that was part of the purpose, there's lots of argument by scholars about how well that worked over the long term. One thing that seems to have happened is that suburban voters wound up with a lot more representation, right? We've been talking in urban versus rural terms for an hour, right? But in fact, there's something in between cities and rural areas called suburbs. And in many states, what you wound up with over the course of, multiple redistricting cycles is state legislatures that are more dominated by the suburbs than by the cities or the rural areas. But if that's where most of the people are living, then that's where most of the representatives should be from, is the logic of the court's decisions, right? And so if people start moving out of the cities, which happened, right, since the 1960s, many cities, including Syracuse, have gotten smaller, right, as people have moved to the suburbs. So the logic of these decisions is then some of the representation should move back out of the cities and to the suburbs as well. Right, one person, one vote. Another parallel with Brown versus Board of Education that's worth thinking about for a second is, in addition to the judicial activism versus judicial restraint sort of dimension of how to understand different Supreme Court decisions, another dimension to think about them on is in terms of whether we're treating the meaning of the Constitution as fixed or evolving. And these two things do not always go together, right? I gotta make some more room on the board here. Here are 4 different things that justices sometimes say about what they're doing. Sometimes justices are advocating for a bold intervention. Sometimes they're advocating for judicial restraint. Sometimes they're advocating for a constitution whose meaning evolves over time. They often use organic, kind of living metaphors. The Constitution is an organism that evolves. And sometimes justices advocate for sticking to the original meaning of the Constitution, not letting it evolve. The best way to think about these is 2 different debates that overlap and intersect in different ways at different times for different justices on different issues, right? One debate is how much the court should intervene, and another debate is whether the constitutional principles on which the court might be intervening are fixed or evolving, right? And they don't always go together, right? Sometimes you have justices arguing for an evolving meaning of the Constitution and judicial restraint. Sometimes you have them arguing for an evolving meaning of the Constitution and judicial activism. Sometimes you have them arguing for a fixed meaning of the Constitution and judicial activism. Sometimes you have them arguing for a fixed meaning of the Constitution and judicial restraint. So just try to analytically separate them. In this particular instance, they line up like this, right? Where the justices arguing for a bold intervention are also arguing for an evolving meaning of the Constitution. That was true in Brown versus Board of Education as well. Right? And it's true here. In Gray versus Sanders, which was one of these cases from 1963, Justice Douglas wrote that the conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments can mean only one thing: one person, one vote. Right? He doesn't say the conception of the political equality that appears in our original Constitution means one person, one vote, right? Which would be pretty hard to argue, right? They had the 3/5 clause in there, right? That does not seem like the principle they were sticking to, right? He doesn't say the principle in the original Constitution. He says the conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, and 19th Amendments. That evolving story of political equality requires one person, one vote. Right? In another case, from this same era, the court struck down poll taxes. Right? Remember that constitutional amendment, which one? The 24th Amendment, prohibited poll taxes in federal elections. But some states were still using poll taxes. And in 1966, the court struck those down too. And now that's just already interesting, right? there was some history in both state and federal elections of the use of poll taxes. We amend the Constitution to say that you're not allowed to use them for federal elections. That amendment doesn't say anything about state elections. And then 2 years later, the court says you're not allowed to use them for state elections either. I'm pretty sure the court is like pushing the Constitution forward, right? It's not, the Constitution itself, with regard to state elections, did not change, right? We did not include that in the amendment. And the court's striking it down anyway, right? And here's what the court says, and this is Justice Douglas again. This one's on your handout. It's the top quote on the back side of the handout. The Equal Protection Clause is not shackled to the political theory of a particular era. In determining what lines are unconstitutionally discriminatory, we have never been confined to historic notions of equality. Notions of what constitutes equal treatment for purposes of the Equal Protection Clause do change. And then he goes on there to reference Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. Just like with school segregation, where we said in 1896 that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. And then we said in 1954, yeah, but we can't turn the clock back to then. We got to decide it in the full light of everything we know today. And now we say that it does violate the 14th Amendment. We are saying the same thing here. Poll taxes used to be constitutional, according to the way that everybody understood the Constitution back then. Now they are not. Right? Even though the words of the Equal Protection Clause, the literal words of the Equal Protection Clause, are still the same, our understanding of those words evolves over time, because the meaning of the words equal protection, that is like an abstract concept of political equality, civil and political equality. It's not likely that if you take two groups of people living 100 years apart from each other, that they are going to understand that concept in the same way. And we do not think that we are required to confine ourselves, to shackle ourselves. That's quite an image there, right? We are not confined to shackle ourselves to the outmoded conceptions of political equality that once governed our country. The court says. That's in the poll tax case. All right? None of these decisions are unanimous. Brown v. Board of Education was unanimous. None of these ones are unanimous. We know Frankfurter was dissented for 55 pages in Baker, and then he had a stroke and he left the court. But there were some other justices on the court who kind of carried on his arguments. Justice Harlan, sometimes confusing. There was a Justice Harlan on the court in the late 19th century who dissented in Plessy versus Ferguson. It is his grandson who is now on the court. It is not the same guy on the court in the 1960s. The second Justice Harlan dissented in some of these cases. And they dissented basically for the same reasons that Justice Frankfurter dissented. Like, we hear you, political equality sounds good, but drawing legislative districts is crazy complicated, involves all kinds of political considerations. It's easy for us to say one person, one vote here. That sounds clear, sounds like it's going to fix everything. It's not going to fix everything. There's all kinds of subsequent questions that are still going to come up. Like, how close do they have to be? Right? Can it be like 100,000 and 101,000? Is that allowed or is that not allowed? Right? I don't know. The court's going to have to decide. Like, how close does it have to be? And these fundamentally are not decisions that the courts should be deciding. We are not elected. We are appointed for life. We do not represent the American people. They don't get to vote us out of office if they don't like what we do. Right? We are not a democratic institution, which is why it's so important for us to exercise our power with caution and restraint, which doesn't mean never, but reluctantly. That's what Harlan and Frankfurter argue. And they repeatedly get outvoted in these cases partly because the justices in the majority on the court as a whole during this period are pushing in a more activist direction, right? This is just one of a number of examples in which they're protecting constitutional rights more robustly than they had before. We just saw that with freedom of speech last week, right? Right? Freedom of speech, court in the 1960s is protecting it much more actively than it had been before. Political equality and voting rights, they're protecting it much more actively than they had been before. So it's partly just that same story, but there's the particular piece about voting rights and election law, where justices like Justice Clark, who sometimes agreed with Frankfurter, is like, I'm inclined to judicial restraint, that makes sense to me, but in this case, just does not work. Right? On voting rights, where you're telling me to defer to the decisions made by the people's elected legislatures, but they were elected under the very unfair policies that are being challenged in this case. Judicial deference and restraint does not make sense to me here, Justice Clark says. So partly it's a general story, and partly it's a particular story about voting rights. We're going to come back to this issue later in the semester and look at some of the more recent disputes, including this year's partisan gerrymandering case, including Bush versus Gore, where the Supreme Court intervened to decide the 2000 election. And so here's a question I want everyone to be thinking about. I guess it's two questions. First question is, are you persuaded by these decisions in the 1960s, right? Are you persuaded that the court was right to intervene to try to fix this sort of problem, right? 60-year-old legislative districts never being redrawn, completely entrenched legislators representing empty acres of land with no people on them, right? The court was right to intervene to try to fix that and to impose the principle of one person, one vote. So that's the first question. Are you persuaded by that? Second question is, what is the best way for the courts to try to build on that principle in other disputes about voting rights and election law? Right? So think about it in terms of Bush versus Gore. Think about it in terms of partisan gerrymandering. Think about it in terms of racial gerrymandering. Right? What is the best way for the court to build on those principles as other disputes come up? And here, just to think about a couple possibilities. One thing that the court sometimes does, and one thing that we spent a lot of time this semester talking about, is focus really precisely on the protection of certain individual rights under the Constitution. Right? You have the right to freedom of speech. We're going to protect that, even if you're crazy, even if you're saying something that most of us think is horrible. Right? We're going to protect your individual right to free speech, because that's what we got to do under the First Amendment. Right? And the court spent a lot of time, and we'll spend a lot of time this semester trying to figure out, well, how exactly do we understand freedom of speech? How far does it go? How exactly do we understand free exercise of religion? How far does it go? How exactly do we understand your right to bear arms? How far does that go? Right? Focusing on those individual rights. That's one thing. These cases are not really about anybody's individual rights. You can try to put them in those terms. Like, is this about somebody's right to vote? Everybody in this state, hypothetically, is allowed to vote. Right? That's a different question, whether they were allowing everybody to vote. But hypothetically, let's say everybody in this state is allowed to vote. You could say that, yeah, but if I live here, my vote is diluted, right? It doesn't weigh as much as somebody else's vote. So that's sort of about my individual right to vote. Right? I live in this city, Memphis or wherever we are in this hypothetical state. That's sort of about my individual right to vote. And the court sometimes sort of talks about it in those terms. But there's also language in these opinions where the court makes clear that the main issue in these cases is not really about any one person or even group of people's individual rights under the Constitution. The main issue in these cases is about the fundamental structure of our democratic process. which is sort of a different way to phrase the question. Like, what, not do our election laws violate anybody's individual constitutional rights? That's one way to phrase it. A different way to phrase it is, are our election laws consistent with the fundamental, is the whole structure of our electoral process consistent with fundamental constitutional principles of equality and whatever else, democracy? That seems like a better description of what the court has to decide in all of these cases, right? What should be the limits on, rich people spending all their money on campaigns? Who should be allowed to draw the districts, and what kinds of factors should they consider, right? Should the two parties, should one party in power try to draw districts in ways that preserve its hold on power? Should the two parties together, this sometimes happens too, be able to collude to come up with election laws that make it impossible for third party and independent candidates to get anywhere, right? Is that allowed? These are not really about people's individual rights. That's related, but they are fundamentally about the overall structure of our democratic political process, and so that seems like a better description of what the court is being asked to decide in these cases. But it does not seem like the sort of thing, it does not seem as much like the sort of thing that we usually ask courts to do. Right? We ask courts to decide on the scope of people's individual rights constantly, every day, all the time. We do not think of ourselves as asking them to decide on what's the best overall fundamental structure, fairest, most democratic structure of our democratic political process. That sounds a little bit more far-reaching, open-ended, like, do we want to give the authority to courts to decide that question, right? And so the two questions to think about when we come back to this issue later in the semester: are you persuaded by these decisions in the 1960s? Does there seem to be some fundamental constitutional principles here that it's important for the courts to try to take seriously and enforce? And then if so, how should the courts try to translate those principles into best policing, imposing some limits on the whole wide range of different questions that arises in disputes about the structure of our electoral process? The main ones we will look at are partisan gerrymandering and vote counting in Florida in 2000, but you can also think of it in terms of voter ID laws and any other kind of current dispute that you hear about election law. That's all. Papers due tomorrow.
Now, because I won't be